John Stuart Mill. Part 1. Liberty. Utilitarianism. Born in 1806, the son of the economist James Mill, John Stuart Mill received one of the most truly extraordinary educations in human history. He started Greek at the age of 3. By the age of 8, he was reading the Greek classics in literature and philosophy. He added Latin to his accomplishments at the age of 8, and all the time, in addition to his classical studies, he was learning mathematics, economics, and history. Because of his father's standing, Mill was incredibly well connected with the most prominent people of his time: Bentham, Ricardo, Say, Saint-Simon, Comte. It's not every young boy who gets taken for walks by Ricardo to chat about economics. Under the influence of his father and Jeremy Bentham, Mill became a utilitarian and remained one in some form or other throughout his life, despite, in the opinion of some critics, holding views whose compatibility with utilitarianism is difficult to reconcile. His book on liberty was published in 1859 and was followed 2 years later by Considerations on Representative Government. These are the two works which will primarily concern us here. It's easy to forget that Mill made contributions to political economy as well as to ethics, politics, and logic. He started in life as a free marketeer, but not without accepting the necessity for state intervention in the economy if it were considered necessary for utilitarian purposes. In his later life, he moved in the direction of socialism, amending his principles of political economy accordingly. This work, first published in 1848, was the Samuelson of its age, being the dominant textbook in economics for well over half a century, until finally displaced by Marshall's Principles of Economics in 1919. Mill's writing, in particular his essay on liberty, have had an enormous effect on modern social and political thought. For all that, however, Mill is not one of the world's great thinkers, least of all one of the most consistent. He has an annoying and persistent habit of giving with one hand and taking away with the other. George Sabine, as usual, puts the matter clearly. On nearly every subject, he was likely to begin with a general statement of principles which, taken literally and by itself, appeared to be as rigid and as abstract as anything that his father might have written. But having thus declared his allegiance to the ancestral dogmas, Mill proceeded to make concessions and restatements so far-reaching that a critical reader was left in doubt whether the original statement had not been explained away. Seemingly committed to a form of utilitarianism in the Benthamite tradition, Mill nevertheless rejected any unitary conception of happiness that could make utilitarianism workable. Mill, writes George Sabine, was not willing to accept Bentham's greatest happiness principle for what in effect it was, namely a rough and ready criterion for judging the utility of legislation. Mill was also not willing to sacrifice his native conviction that freedom and integrity were, in some sense, intrinsic goods, apart from any contribution their possession might make to some utilitarian notion of happiness or pleasure. There is a persistent tension between Mill's residual utilitarianism and his latent anti-utilitarian conception of the human good. If a classic is a book that everybody thinks he's read, but few actually have, then John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty is definitely a classic. I suspect that very few people have read it through from beginning to end, and most people are therefore of the opinion that Mill is a doughty defender of the freedom of the individual against the combined forces of society and state. That opinion is not entirely wrong, though it is not entirely right either. Those who would object to a portrayal of John Stuart Mill as the white knight of liberty include Ayn Rand, who trenchantly describes on liberty as the most pernicious piece of collectivism ever adopted by suicidal defenders of liberty. Mill believes that the core thesis of On Liberty can be expressed in one very simple principle, which should govern the dealings of society with the individual, whether those dealings are exercised through legal means or by means of the moral coercion of public opinion. It is worth quoting at some length the passage which contains this principle. The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can rightfully be exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. He cannot rightfully be compelled to do or forbear, because it will be better for him to do so, because it will make him happier, because, in the opinions of others, to do so would be wise or even right. These are good reasons for remonstrating with him, or reasoning with him, or persuading him, or entreating him, but not for compelling him, or visiting him with any evil in case he do otherwise. To justify that, the conduct from which it is desired to deter him must be calculated to produce evil to someone else. The only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part that merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. Even at the removal of over 150 years, it is hard not to be moved by the obvious sincerity and forcefulness of this famous passage. A clearer, more unambiguous, more succinctly stated defense of the liberty of the individual has surely never been produced by any other writer. And yet, there is a problem with this one very simple principle, and it is this. What we have in this passage isn't obviously one. It certainly isn't simple, and that may not, in the end, even be Mill's guiding principle. Before taking a closer look at this one very simple principle, let's examine the broader context of Mill's thought. Mill thinks it expedient to begin his treatment of liberty by considering one particular form of it which, he believes, is generally recognized by current opinions: liberty of thought. The justification of this form of liberty is not peculiar to it alone, but has much wider application, so that if we can come to grips with it, we will find much that is applicable to other aspects of liberty as well. Mill lists 4 grounds on which both freedom of opinion and freedom of expression of opinion, not quite the same thing, can be shown to be necessary to the well-being of mankind. First, the silenced opinion may be true, or second, it may contain a portion of truth, even if it is not completely true. Third, received opinion, which is wholly true, if it cannot be challenged, will be held in the manner of a prejudice, with little comprehension or feeling of its rational grounds. And fourth, such an opinion, if not subject to challenge, will be in danger of collapsing into a formal and inefficacious dogma. Of these 4 grounds, the latter 2, which relate to the prevention of dogmatism and connected as they are to Mill's deeper concerns about human development, are much more important to Mill than the first 2, which focus on the discernment of truth. David Brink notes that Mill's claim that the value of freedom of expression lies in keeping true beliefs from becoming dogmatic reflects his view that freedoms of thought and discussion are necessary for fulfilling our natures as progressive beings. The basic principle of liberty is non-interference by individuals, groups of individuals, or governments with the actions of others, or with the thoughts or the expression of those thoughts by others. While thought as such is free absolutely, the expression of thought and actions are subject to the condition of their not harming others. However, the expression of thought is so close to thought itself that any social limitations on it should be minimal. Where, however, talk turns into action, then restraint may not only be permitted, but may even be required. The implicit principle here, writes Magid, is that as long as discussion remains discussion, it ought to be permitted absolute freedom. But once it passes beyond discussion to action, it ought to be treated as action. Where opinions move closer to action, as in incitement, opinions can be controlled by social or political means. Now, how does all this apply more widely to matters beyond freedom of opinion or freedom of expression of opinion? Here, Mill expresses himself in a mode that Aristotle would not have found alien. He believes that the human good lies in a kind of deliberative choosing which gives direction to one's life. If choice is to be genuine and informed, then not only must we have liberty of opinion and expression of opinion, we must also, within certain limitations, have liberty of action. one could make a case for the legal restriction of individual liberty on a number of grounds. One could restrict Jones's exercise of liberty for Jones's own good, paternalism, or to prevent him from acting immorally, moralism, or to prevent him offending another, offence protection, or to prevent him causing harm to others, harm prevention. This gives us 4 possible grounds for restricting liberty: paternalism, moralism, offence prevention, and harm prevention. Mill is not willing to concede that the immorality of a person's action just by itself is a legitimate ground for the legal restriction of his actions. That's number 2. Restriction of liberty on the grounds of mere offence, number 3, is ruled out by Mill when he writes, "The acts of an individual may be hurtful to others or wanting in due consideration for their welfare without going the length of violating any of their constituted rights. The offender may then be justly punished by opinion, though not by law." Mill subscribes wholeheartedly to the principle volenti non fit injuria, which means to the willing there can be no injury, so that society has no justifiable interest in protecting those who consent to actions that cause them harm. Restricting a person's liberty for the good of that person, number 1, is a form of paternalism that Mill is prepared to tolerate only where the person in question, such as a child, is incapable of the proper exercise of liberty. This acceptable form of paternalism may then be employed in respect of individuals or indeed in respect of whole societies. It is important to realize that the prescriptions on liberty apply fully only to societies at a high stage of development, adult societies as it were. Mill doesn't think that his reflections on liberty apply always and everywhere. The full benefits of liberty are confined to people and societies that are mature. Liberty is not something that is valuable unconditionally. If liberty is instrumentally valuable, then, if the other constituent elements for human perfection are lacking, liberty, unable to bring about this condition all by itself, loses much of its value. Given that liberty is essentially instrumental for Mill and to be valued insofar as it contributes to a developed human life, some particular forms of liberty are going to be more important than others. Mill then rejects grounds 2 and 3 completely as possible grounds for the restrictions of liberty and accepts 1 only in a qualified way. And so that leaves only the harm prevention ground, number 4, in the running for a condition that might unconditionally restrict liberty. Was Mill a utilitarian? Despite his professed allegiance to utilitarianism, Mill's most significant contribution to social and political thought was his on liberty, the arguments of which are not always obviously in accord with that doctrine. For Mill, freedom of thought and investigation, freedom of discussion, and the freedom of self-controlled moral judgment and action were goods in their own right, writes Sabine. Mill did in fact believe that freedom would be beneficial to society, and in that sense his support for it was utilitarian. However, his commitment to freedom went well beyond utilitarian considerations. His real reason for supporting freedom was that it produces and gives scope to a high type of moral character. To hear public questions freely discussed, to have a share in political decisions, to have moral conviction, and to take the responsibility for making them effective are among the ways in which reasonable human beings are produced. So writes Sabine. Mill distinguishes in a non-utilitarian way between superior and inferior pleasures. Not all pleasures are commensurable. The pursuit of higher pleasures is productive of justice and progress, so that any society in which higher pleasures are to be produced needs social freedom. This distinction between higher and lower pleasures, however plausible in itself, fatally compromises the utilitarian side of Mill's thought. If pleasures are not commensurable, then it is simply not possible to have a calculus. How many lower pleasures does one higher pleasure equal? There can be no answer to this question. McClelland plays down the significance of this problem, noting that Mill knew perfectly well that his additions to the utilitarian agenda were not amenable to the arithmetical rigours of the Benthamite philosophic calculus. But whether Mill knew this or not is not strictly relevant to the conceptual knot at the heart of Mill's thought. How is Mill supposed to reconcile his utilitarianism and his liberalism? One can be a utilitarian and one can be a liberal, but it's not immediately obvious that one can be both. Paul Kelly notes, "We cannot simply explain away this inconsistency in terms of the peculiar point of each work, because even in On Liberty, Mill claims that he builds his account of liberty on the foundations of utility." Henry McGee remarks that, while Mill is still in some residual sense a utilitarian, the core has been so modified and expanded that the resultant theory has a cast different from that of original utilitarianism. Government does not exist merely to produce the maximum of that kind of pleasure which the citizens happen to prefer. Rather, some types of pleasure are better than others, and the government has the responsibility for having its citizens educated to pursue the higher pleasures in place of the lower pleasures. In the end, what Mill stood for was the valorization of human dignity and moral responsibility, freedom not just as a means to human fulfillment, but as a constitutive part of that fulfillment, freedom as both an individual good and a social good, and a positive role for the state in offsetting the dangers of the dominant society. A libertarian can concur wholeheartedly with the first three of these positions, however much Mill, as a utilitarian, might not have been philosophically entitled to hold them. But there is no way he could accept the fourth. What is particularly striking about Mill's On Liberty is that his strategy is not to carve out a space for liberty against government intrusion. Rather, it is intended to address the dangers to liberty presented by society. The threat to liberty which Mill chiefly feared was not government, but a majority that is intolerant of the unconventional, that looks with suspicion on divergent minorities, and is willing to use the weight of numbers to repress and regiment them, writes Sabine. The state constrains the liberty of the individual formally through law, but society constrains it informally by means of public opinion. The only way for individuals to defend themselves against both state and society was through eternal vigilance over the state and through self-assertion over prevailing opinion. Of the two threats to liberty, that from society is by far the most potent. The individual then needs to be protected not only from the state but also from society. Mill writes, "Protection, therefore, against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There needs protection also against the tyranny of the prevailing opinion and feeling, against the tendency of society to impose, by other means than civil penalties, its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them, to fetter the development and, if possible, prevent the formation of any individuality not in harmony with its ways, and compel all characters to fashion themselves upon the model of its own. There is a limit to the legitimate interference of collective opinion with individual independence, and to find that limit and maintain it against encroachment is as indispensable to a good condition of human affairs as protection against political despotism." On this point, a libertarian is likely to find himself disagreeing with Mill. Provided that no physical aggression is used to influence behaviour, there appears to be nothing obviously improper with social means of producing conformity. Persuasion, exhortation, non-association or shunning, all these are legitimate activities if unaccompanied by the initiation or the threat of the initiation of physical violence. Mill was right, of course, to grasp the practical significance of social pressure in inducing a measure of conformity to social norms, but whatever the force of such social pressure, unless that pressure be physical, it cannot be of direct concern to a libertarian. If Mill had been a consistent utilitarian, then liberty would have had only an instrumental value inasmuch as it was a means to man's overall happiness. But this was not Mill's view. For him, liberty of thought and speech and action was a good whether or not it made a contribution to happiness, although he did in fact think that liberty was and would be happiness producing. Mill appears to have three courses of action open to him. Either he remains inconsistent in maintaining a non-instrumental conception of freedom and a distinction between higher and lower pleasures at the same time as he purports to be a utilitarian, Or he keeps his utilitarianism and gives up non-instrumental freedom and the distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Or he keeps non-instrumental freedom and the distinction between higher and lower pleasures, but gives up utilitarianism. In the end, then, Mill is an inconsistent utilitarian, a thinker whose ethical views were more Kantian than Benthamite. He desired freedom for thought and action, protected not only from the interference of the state, but from the oppression of social majorities. But it is difficult to discern the principal basis on which he could make his case. Mill was concerned to delineate a sphere of activity for individuals in respect of which neither state nor society had a legitimate interest that would permit either to intervene, to supervise, or to restrict. Sketching out such a sphere is not especially difficult if one has at one's disposal a theory of natural rights, but of course, as a utilitarian, Mill had no such tools to hand. The result of the conceptual confusion at the base of Mill's thought is that his practical application of his principles was arbitrary. The prohibition on the sale of alcohol, for example, was an illegitimate restriction of liberty, but mandatory public education was not. He was prepared to accept a plethora of regulations on business and enterprise, so much so that nothing is left of any commitment he may ever have had to laissez-faire.